Hello, it's Jacob again, and in this video, we'll be talking about excludability and rivalry. Now, so far throughout this course, I have been operating off of two implicit assumptions about the nature of goods. Now, the first of these assumptions is that goods are what we call rivalrous. And what that means is, well, there's two different ways you could formulate this. What you use, somebody else cannot also use, or equivalently, if you want to provide more of the good, you must incur additional costs to do so. And this describes most physical goods as well as most personal services. Two people cannot eat the same cheeseburger. Two people cannot eat the same slice of pizza. They might share a pizza, but they can only have their own portion of it. They can't eat the part that the other person eats. Two people can't wear the same pair of jeans. They might share a pair of jeans. One may wear it at one time, the other may wear it at a different time. But they can't wear the same pair at the same time. They can't drive the same car at the same time. They can't get a haircut from a barber at the same time. They can't get a surgery from a surgeon at the same time, not from the same surgeon at the same time, and so on and so forth. This is a very common situation, which is why it's also been implicit up to this point. Most physical things and most services we receive have this nature about them that additional consumption requires additional production, which requires additional resources. Now, the other big assumption I've been making is that goods are what we call excludable. If you own the good, you can stop other people from using it. And because of that, you can enforce payment for the use of the good. Now, in reality, most goods are somewhat rivalrous, and most goods can be made excludable at some cost. And we might think of a road to illustrate this point. If it's a typical public road, then by default, the road is actually non-rivalrous and non-excludable. If it's a public road, nobody has the right to stop somebody from getting on the road, so it's free. Anyone can come along and use it. And at the same time, it's non-rivalrous because anybody can, somebody else may drive on the road without taking a spot away from you. Hypothetically, you could have a road so congested that it is literally bumper to bumper and there's no more space to fill. But up until that point, adding an additional car does not deny someone else the opportunity to drive onto the road. Yet, the road is not perfectly non-rivalrous. Roads suffer from congestion. They suffer from strong negative network externalities, where the more people there are, the slower the road moves, the more unpleasant driving on it is. The road may not be used up, but it does become worse. And a road can also be made excludable. If you were to put a toll booth on it, you would find that to be so. With a toll booth, you could charge people a fee for entry. So because of this, we may do better to think of excludability and rivalry as being a spectrum that runs between two ideal states. Think like a Platonic ideal. And if you've ever seen a Nolan chart before, you should be able to get this idea pretty easily. You've got one axis of excludability versus non-excludability. So at one extreme, you would have a perfectly excludable good. It costs nothing to stop people from using it, and you can stop them from using it perfectly. And at the other extreme, there is no possible way to prevent them from using it. And then on the other axis, you have rivalry and non-rivalry. If it's maximally rivalrous, there's no way to share it. Producing any more would require bearing a cost. Whereas if it's perfectly non-rivalrous, giving the good to more people would be free, and it would not affect other people's experience. There would be no negative network externalities to tarnish it. Now, based on these two axes, excludability and rivalry, we can then categorize goods into four broad categories. So-called private goods, which will, again, being excludable and rivalrous, that's the type of goods we've been talking about up to this point. Physical goods, personal services. Then there are the excludable but non-rivalrous club goods. This would describe things that you can stop people from using if they don't pay, but it doesn't cost them anything extra to let more people use it. In the modern world, that mostly means roads, subscription services, really any kind of like digital information service, subscription services, downloads, and satellite service. And then we have the non-excludable goods. And the rivalrous ones we'll call commons goods. Very often those are raw resources of some kind. Being a physical thing, to use it leaves less for others. You might imagine something like, say, fishing in the ocean. The more fish you pull out, the less fish there are left. Or air. The more clean air you dirty up, the less clean air there is left. The average quality of the air decreases. And when a good is non-excludable and non-rivalrous, we call it a public good. And we'll get into more detail with that later in the lecture. But for now, that basically includes various emergency services and scientific research, public sanitation, things like that. Things that you consider to be sort of the basic functions of a government. And that's also why they're called public goods, because they are the goods for which public provision is economically efficient. Now, as long as a good is excludable, it's expected to be efficient because it can be turned into property and priced in markets. The market is more than capable of handling it on its own, and as we know from the central planning lecture, markets generally beat planned economies. Sorry, I should say command economies. In this profession, we've been trying to move away from the term planned economies because market economies are also planned. They're just decentralized in their planning. As long as you can force people to pay, you have a viable private market. If you can't force people to pay, then you don't have a very feasible business model. And there is interesting stuff you can say about the distinction between club goods and private goods, but we're not going to get into that in this course. There just isn't enough time to cover every little facet of this. What we'll be focusing on is non-excludability, because non-excludability is going to result in market failures. And there's actually two different ways that the failure can manifest itself. I refer to the commons good situation as actually being a policy failure because, well, let's just go ahead and get to it. The problem here is that being non-excludable, you are unable to deny people access to the resource. You are unable to create a functioning market to ration the resource or to produce the resource. And depending on its rivalry, is it rivalrous or not, you're going to wind up with one of two very different yet very similar problems. If the good is non-excludable and rivalrous, then a lack of property rights is going to result in too much being taken. And we call that a tragedy of the commons. And hence, it is a commons good. It's commonly held by the public. If it's non-excludable and non-rivalrous, then it's impossible to form a market for it due to free rider problems. And your only solution is going to be to make it public. So both of these problems result from non-excludability, but depending on the rivalry, you either wind up with underproduction or overproduction. Over and under. And you have two very different solutions to these, as you're either going to have to privatize the good to make it viable, or you're going to have to publicly provide it to make it viable. So in the next video, we'll pick up with the tragedy of the commons and explore how that works.